President Andrew Johnson was the first American president to be impeached, and nearly the only to be removed from office. Under the United States Constitution, there's a two-step process to impeachment. The House votes to impeach based off of a simple majority. President Andrew Johnson, President William Clinton, and President Donald Trump have all been impeached. No one, however, has been removed from office. In order to be removed from office, you need to be found guilty at your impeachment trial. At the impeachment trial, the Senate acts as the jury, requiring two-thirds majority to remove from office. Andrew Johnson came one vote short. Andrew Johnson's trial is in many ways unique. One of the reasons that it's unique is we have to remember that Andrew Johnson wasn't supposed to be there. Abraham Lincoln won re-election in 1864. Unfortunately, he was assassinated just after the end of the American Civil War. You'll see the quotation down there by Edwin Stanton, "Now he belongs to the ages." That's important, and not the least bit a little ironic, as Edwin Stanton, one of President Lincoln's biggest supporters, will be one of President Johnson's detractors and probably the most important person at his impeachment trial. Now, at the outset of the Civil War in 1861, Andrew Johnson was a senator from Tennessee. He is actually the only senator who remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War. That being said, he was never an abolitionist. Senator Andrew Johnson held what we would call today to be particularly racist worldviews. His views, however, tended to be more egalitarian. He was popular in Tennessee because he hated the wealthy planters. He hated the landing classes. He liked poor whites, and poor whites supported him. Now, for his loyalty to the Union, President Lincoln appointed him as the military governor of Tennessee in 1862. Then he joins Lincoln's ticket, even though Johnson is a Democrat and Lincoln is a Republican. The two men run together in 1864 for president and vice president, respectively. Johnson, to a large extent, is added to the ticket in order to bolster Lincoln's popularity in some of the border states. President Andrew Johnson was sworn in after Lincoln's assassination in April 1865. The problem that happens almost from the outset is that it becomes clear that Andrew Johnson and the Republican members of Congress do not agree on the policies that are called Reconstruction. Reconstruction is the period of American history that lasts from basically 1865 to 1877. Reconstruction is the series of policies that are put in place to rebuild and rehabilitate the conquered South after the American Civil War. The issue is that Johnson and the quote-unquote radical Republicans who control Congress don't agree on what Reconstruction should look like. For example, President Johnson enacted a very lenient Reconstruction policy for the defeated South, granting almost total amnesty to all ex-Confederates. And this is a program also of rapid restoration of the United States status for seceded states. And he, by and large, would approve new local Southern governments, which were able to legislate what were called black codes. These black codes preserved the system of slavery in many cases in all but names. The problem from Republicans in Congress perspective was this was an insult to all the people who had fought and died and given so much to win the Civil War. To see those same ex-Confederates turn around and resume the reins of power in the South was just too much for many in the Republican legislature to take. As a result, Johnson and the radical Republicans have a major falling out, and the two are antagonistic for the rest of Andrew Johnson's tenure in office. Edwin Stanton, who is his Secretary of War, and he was the Secretary of War under Lincoln, is also a radical Republican and a major thorn in the side of Johnson throughout the early years of his tenure in office. So, what happens is the Republicans take a series of actions to try to constrain Johnson's authority. Specifically, in March 1867, in order to further weaken Johnson's authority, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act over his veto. The act prohibited the president from removing federal office holders, including cabinet members like Edwin Stanton, from the cabinet unless Johnson got the consent of Congress. It was designed to shield members of Johnson's cabinet, like Secretary of War Stanton, who was appointed during the Lincoln administration, from being removed. In the fall of 1867, Johnson attempted to test the constitutionality of this act because he's going to argue throughout this process that the Tenure of Office Act is not constitutional. Under the Constitution of the United States, we have what are called separation of powers, which means different branches of government get different powers. Traditionally, the cabinet, once it's appointed by Congress, has always been a part of the executive branch. Every president from George Washington on has had the right to terminate cabinet members if they choose to without congressional oversight. This was the first time that the legislative branch was saying, no, 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 we get a say in this. But in this case, it was purely political. However, in the fall of 1867, the United States Supreme Court refused to rule on the case, and General Stanton was not replaced in that instance. However, in February of 1868, President Johnson decided that he was going to get rid of Edwin Stanton once and for all, no matter what happened. His decision was he was going to try to appoint General Lorenzo Thomas, an individual who was far less favorable to Congress, as the new Secretary of War. What happened next is almost comical. Edwin Stanton refused to yield the office and actually physically barricaded himself within his office so that he couldn't be removed. While this was all going on, the House of Representatives, initiated impeachment proceedings on the basis that Andrew Johnson had violated the Tenure of Office Act. Now, in order to impeach a president of the United States, you need to find them guilty of what's called, quote unquote, high crimes and misdemeanors. The Constitution doesn't give us any additional guidance beyond that. So, what exactly a president was supposed to do wrong in order to be impeached and then subsequently removed from office has remained a little murky ever since. These trials and these proceedings are always inherently political. And it's not so much of a question, oftentimes, of what the president did as it is who happens to be the jury at the time, because the jury is always going to be the Senate. And whatever political party controls the Senate has a better chance of either convicting or acquitting the president in each individual case. So, on February the 24th of 1868, the House voted on 11 impeachment articles against President Johnson. 9 of these articles cited violations of the Tenure of Office Act. Ultimately, 3 counts of impeachment will proceed to the Senate. So the Senate now acts as the jury, with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Salmon Chase, operating as the judge in the jury. So on March the 13th, according to the rules set out in Article 1 of the United States Constitution, the impeachment trial of President Johnson began in the United States Senate. As I mentioned, U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase presided over the proceedings, which have largely been described as theatrical. By and large, there was very little witness testimony during the trial. Ultimately, this came down to both sides making grand and sweeping speeches about the momentous nature of what was happening and the need to either preserve the president or get rid of the seditious traitor, depending upon what side you came down on. In the end, the Senate votes. Both times there's a vote, and the vote is 35 for conviction, 19 for acquittal. 7 moderate Republicans joined 12 Democrats in voting against what was honestly probably a fairly weak case for impeachment, because in this case, it really did seem like Congress invented a crime that Johnson was going to commit so that they could then bring impeachment proceedings against him. So he was judged not guilty and remained in office. Nevertheless, Andrew Johnson does not choose to seek re-election on the Democratic ticket. In November, Ulysses S. Grant, the former United States general in the Civil War and who supported the Republicans' radical Reconstruction policies, would be elected president of the United States. In 1875, Johnson was actually reelected to Congress as a U.S. Senator from Tennessee, but he died less than 4 months after taking office. The interesting thing, though, is to do one quick caveat when it comes to this trial, because it turns out that Johnson only survived his impeachment trial by one. That's right, one vote. Andrew Johnson fell one vote short of being the only United States president ever impeached and then removed from office. That one vote came from Senator Edmund Ross of Kansas. His is an interesting case and has baffled historians for some time since, because for all intents and purposes, he was a Republican. He was expected to vote against Johnson and had told everyone that he was going to. Then suddenly, the night before the final roll call vote, something happened. The Senate chamber was truly stunned the next day when Edmund Ross stood up and announced his verdict: not guilty. The radical Republicans actually asked for an adjournment to the following day to see if they could get Ross to switch his votes. But by May the 26th, the votes on 2 more articles of impeachment failed again, Ross voting not guilty, and Andrew Johnson was not impeached. The question is, why did Edmund Ross change his mind? Now, there's 2 big constitutional reasons why he might have. One is something I hinted at already. A lot of people didn't actually think that the Tenure of Office Act was constitutional in the first place. They didn't think that the charges were fair. The other point is more interesting, and that's because the Constitution at that point didn't specify who became vice president when the president died or couldn't serve. So what that means is President Lincoln was assassinated, okay? President Johnson succeeds him as president, but there is no replacement as vice president because the Constitution doesn't say how to do it yet. So the suggestion has been that perhaps Edmund Ross changed his vote because he didn't know who was going to be the new president. People believe if Johnson had been impeached, the Senate president pro tempore, Benjamin Wade, would have assumed the duties of office until the next election. But he had enemies within the Republican Party. In fact, Ross, we believe, might have been afraid that Wade would take away some of his patronage powers in Kansas if Wade became president. So his decision might have been constitutional, or it might have been based off of which way he thought he could get the better deal. In other words, Edmund Ross was satisfied with the way things were working out for Edmund Ross under Andrew Johnson and didn't want to take the chance that if Wade became president, that he would lose what he got. And then there's one third theory. The third theory is that Ross didn't follow his conscience at all. He followed the cash. Ross, there's some evidence to believe, may have been the beneficiary of a $150,000, it's a lot of money back then, slush fund set up by Johnson's supporters. We may never know. But in the end, President Johnson was found not guilty by one vote, ending the first ever impeachment proceedings in the history of the United States.